going to have to make a decision. Am I going to stay in this valley, or am I going to do what the psalmist said and walk through this valley because God is with me? You have a decision to make in any valley that you find yourself in. Are you going to lay down and die, or are you going to get up and fight? I want to talk to you today just for a few moments in time about the valley belongs to God. All right, so Psalm 23 and verse 4 reads it like this. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now there's a lot of lines, and there's a lot of truth in this text that we don't sit in this valley. We don't lay down in this valley. We walk through this valley. Now, sometimes I like to run. But sometimes when you run, you get out ahead of God. You got to walk. Walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, the psalmist wrote this. And when he wrote this verse, he's writing it to people who would have a good understanding of the lay of the land of which he was writing about. The land that he was writing about is a distinctive and a very unique landscape of which he's writing this psalm about. And he's writing it in what we would call the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel basically has four main geographic regions. It's made up of the coastal plains, the central highlands, the Jordan Rift Valley, and then the desert of Negev. And as you look at those four areas, I believe that God chose this land that he's talking about because in this land there are some spiritual truths that are wrapped up in the landmarks and the lay of the land. So if we looked at the first geographic area, which is the coastal plains, we could say that is the status quo. If we just living out in the plains of life, that's just kind of the status quo, just kind of going along. The central highlands were the places of victory. The Jordan Rift Valley is what many of us would call a valley. And do I need to define what a valley is for us in our lives? It's usually the place where we feel low. Then the desert of Negev would be the dry places. Sometimes we get with God and we feel like, man, I was really in touch with God. I was walking with God and I'm not hearing God like I used to hear God. You're in a dry place. That doesn't mean that God isn't speaking or that God has changed. It's just you're dry. And so in those four areas, God can speak to us about our lives by kind of where we're at. Some of us are in the status quo. You won't stay there for long in a church like this. We're in a place of victory. We're in a valley. Or some of us are in dry places. And the Jordan Rift Valley is an area that includes the Jordan River, the Jordan Valley, the Sea of Galilee, and the Dead Sea, which is the lowest land elevation on the earth. And in the Jordan Rift Valley, the land is very rugged. It's so rugged that it only allows for maybe a few narrow paved roads and a few mountain paths that are extremely difficult to traverse. Or if you have a bus driver like we had, he didn't care what it was. He was going to drive 90 with a 5-speed. And we prayed through on that bus a lot. And all of this that we talk about in this land is the land that God gave to Abram in Genesis chapter 12 and verses 1 through 8. Now, I'm not trying to be political at all. I'm just telling you that's the land that God gave to Abraham. I don't know if you believe in the news or not, but that land belongs to God. So, over the years, after the Lord spoke to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, the people of God had a long and a difficult time of possessing the land of promise. Even today, the people of God still struggle to maintain the land that God promises them. What's going on in the natural is something that is happening in the spiritual. The people of God have a hard time maintaining what God has promised them. We are willing to give up what God has given to us because the enemy threatens us. The enemy terrorizes us. And so we will back down because we don't want anybody to think that we're standing on some promises that are just for us and not them. But the promise could be for them if they would become a son of promise. We have some things that are going to be happening in the end time days with the church that you're going to have to get over the favor of God in your life and stop apologizing for how good God is to you, so that when people ask you, how can your business be blessed in this time of inflation and my business is going down? Well, my business belongs to the Lord. Why is your family all put back together again? Because my family belongs to the Lord. I'm sorry you went through a divorce, but my marriage is before the Lord. Why is your finances doing all right? Because my finances, even though I only have 90%, I'd rather have 90% blessed than 100% cursed. I just want to know, are y'all with me today? Don't get nervous. You get nervous, you're going to walk yourself right out of a miracle. So the people of God struggle to maintain the land that God promises them. And this land is more than just natural land with real purpose. It has great spiritual lessons that should be applied to the lives of every Christian today. Israel is a land that's filled with mountains and valleys. And each of them were named to mark an important event or happening that occurred at that place. And then as you read through the Old Testament, you find all kinds of numerous mountains and valleys whose name aptly demonstrates the events that occurred in or on them. They had trouble there, they had a fight there, they had a calamity there, and all of these places that the people of God would go, and all of the mountains and valleys, they were always going to possess their land. As you go to possess what God has promised to you, you're going to have mountaintops and you're going to have valleys. You're going to have days where you're going up and days where you're going down. Then the next day you may be going up and the next day you're going down. And the next day you're going up and the next day you're going down. And you're going to find some church person that's going to tell you that when you're going down, you're out of the will of God. I'm not out of the will of God at all. I'm headed to my promised land, and the hills and the valleys and the mountains and the downsides are just the enemy trying to discourage me from going after what God has promised me. Let me name a few of them. Some of the famous mountains. There was Mount Ararat. This is where Noah's Ark came to rest. There was Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments. There was the Mount of Olives, where Jesus prayed before his arrest and his crucifixion. There was Mount Zion, that David had captured, and it became the city of David, and then later would become the place of Solomon's temple. There was one called Mount Tabor, or you might know it better as the Mount of Transfiguration. There was Mount Carmel, where Elijah had a call of fire to consume a sacrifice and defeat Baal. There was Mount Moriah, where Abraham took Isaac and had his faith tested and then his faith confirmed, because on that top of that mountain, God was showing the type of a lamb that was going to be the substitution for a son. Then you have Mount Calvary. And on the top of Mount Calvary, we know what happened, right? So I want to ask you, if all the times in the Bible on the top of mountains, there were sacrifices and there were fights and there were battles and there were crucifixions, why are you battling so hard for the top of a mountain? Because I believe the enemy has tricked us. I believe the enemy wants us to live on the top of the mountain and leave the valleys alone. I don't know if you've ever been out west to the Rocky Mountains. Most of you, I think, have been to the Smokies. In the Smokies, there's trees and there's life and there's birds. But you get up to the top of the Rockies, there isn't anything living up there. It's just rock and snow and a crazy ranger. Because life is not lived on the top of mountains. Life is lived in the valleys. And so the enemy wants you to constantly be worried about the next mountain so you forget about the valley. And you forget about all the life that's lived down here, and all you're focused on is up here. Some of us need to take our focus off of the next mountain and fight a fight in the valley. And this is because we've been led to believe, like the enemy wants us to believe, that if you're in a valley, you're defeated. And absolutely, valleys are some tough times. There was the valley of Achor in Joshua chapter 7, which meant trouble and calamity. There was the valley of Hinnom, which means the lamentation or great cry in Joshua chapter 15. There was the valley of Rephaim, which is the valley of the giants in Joshua chapter 15 and verse 8. There was the valley of Baca, or the valley of weeping in Psalm 84 and verse 6. There was in Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 32, there was the valley of slaughter. We're like, I don't want to be in that one. Then there was the valley of dead bodies in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 40. Then in Joel chapter 3, there was the valley of Jehoshaphat, or the valley of judgment. Then in Joel chapter 3 and verse 14, there was the valley of decision. And you're thinking, you just told me all the things that happen on top of the mountain, and now you're talking about all the things that happen in the valley. I'll choose the mountain. I'll choose the mountain every time. But the enemy wants to destroy you before you ever get there. And if you're not willing to fight in the valley, you won't ever claim a mountain either. So regardless of where the people of God traveled, they were encountering mountain, valley. Just as they did, so do we. And all through life, as we consistently travel from mountain to valley, that's just the journey of life. We, like the people of Israel, the people of God, we've been in the valley of trouble. Anybody ever been in trouble before? I got myself in trouble about 7.5 minutes ago where I was talking about a trunk with my mother. I am now in the valley of trouble. Pray for me. Because now it's like 4 against 1. It's Melissa, Morgan, Zoe, and my mom against me. And even the dogs are going to gang up on me later. The valley of trouble. We've been in the valley of decision. Anybody ever been in the valley of decision? I don't know which way to go. I don't know whether I should go forward or go backward, go sideward. I'm in the valley of decision. Has anybody ever been in the valley of weeping? I've been in the valley of weeping. While 6 years ago on this day, as they sang the final song over my father, I began to weep over what I was losing. I began to weep. I've been in the valley of weeping. If you've never been there, just wait. You'll get there. Oh, I don't cry. There'll be something that'll bring you to your knees. I've been in the valley that seemed like all of the problems of my life were like big giants in front of me. Anybody ever been in the valley of giants before? Something in front of you that seems insurmountable, a cancer diagnosis that you didn't know how you were going to get yourself out of it. The valley of giants, the problem is larger than life itself. We've been through what the writer of Corinthians penned in the New Testament, where he said, we've been persecuted, we've been cast down, we've been perplexed. But just like what the writer of Psalm 23 said, when we went through the valley of the shadow of death, we went through it because God was with me. Corinthian writer said, but even though we've been perplexed and we've been cast down, we feel like we've been persecuted, but we are not destroyed. You can go through all of those valleys and walk through every one of them. You can come out of every valley of weeping victorious. You can come out of every valley of trouble victorious. You can come out of the valley of the shadow of death victorious. You can come out of a valley and be victorious. You do not have to die in a valley. You do not have to die in front of your giants. How about you slay the giant instead of laying down and dying in front of him? And so what happens to us, though, is when we get into a valley, we find ourselves in a valley, we feel like we're not even understanding what David wrote when we're in our valley. Has anybody ever read Psalm 23 and said, David hasn't been where I'm at? We feel like green pastures and still waters are distant memories. We feel like the leading of the shepherd, he forgot where he was going. Maybe you haven't been there. Let me just go back and reference it again. 6 years ago, I felt like the good shepherd had lost his map. What do you mean my father took his last breath? This was not supposed to happen this way. And I found myself in a valley. Maybe you've never been there. Maybe you've never questioned God. God bless you. But me, I was wondering what in the world had happened here. There were so many prayers and so many blankets and so many prayer cloths and so many scriptures. I'm like, Lord, my father did not die for lack of faith. And I found myself wondering and going through all of these valleys all at the same time. I was in the valley of trouble. I was in the valley of weeping. I was in the valley of decision. I was in the valley of giants. I was in every one of those valleys all within the same hour. Then you're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to stay in this valley, or am I going to do what the psalmist said and walk through this valley because God is with me? You have a decision to make in any valley that you find yourself in. Are you going to lay down and die, or are you going to get up and fight? So when we get in these valleys, man, it's dark and treacherous in the valley. The best way to describe some of the valleys is just say it's a valley of death. The shadow of death. And it's here, we say, why, God, why did you lead me here? God, this is too hard for me. God, why is this happening? And we often, anybody ever tried to avoid these valleys? The valley is unavoidable. And even though you pass through it, just because you're walking through it, a valley does not have to define you. It does not have to be a place of failure or depression or oppression or fear. The valley does not have to destroy you. It may be the darkest moment of your life, but it doesn't have to destroy you. It doesn't have to cause fear that paralyzes you. If you are overcome with fear and then paralyzed by it, then you will not pass through the valley will pass through you. So how do you know which valley you're in? Just look around. The evidence is all over the place. Now, many people say, well, if you're in a valley, Pastor, then something's wrong in your life. No, the reason why I'm in the valley is because the enemy is trying to make me believe that something is wrong in my life. The enemy is trying to use the valley to get me to question my Father. The enemy is using the valley to think that I'm on a derail away from my God. Have anybody ever been in a valley before when the sun went down? Lots of shadows. If you're looking at the shadows in the valley, you're no longer looking at the sun. And what happens to us is when we get in a valley, we look at the shadow of the valley of death and stop turning around and looking to the one who gave us life in the first place. And so when it starts going down and getting dark, you need to go after the sun. And if you follow the sun will take you out of the valley.